Vampire King complained his waitress suffocated him until her silence gave space he regretted. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Let us return to the main character. Alexander Crow had ruled rooms like this for longer than most buildings around him had existed, and tonight was no different as he sat at the private dining level above the city, glass walls stretching from floor to ceiling, the skyline hovering like a quiet promise beyond. He didn't need to look at the clock to know the hour, or at the menu to know what would be served, or at the people around him to know when they would speak. Everything followed his rhythm. Everything except the one presence he never consciously commanded. Emily Carter moved through the space the way she always did, careful, efficient, almost invisible, her steps soft against the polished floor, her posture respectful without being timid. She didn't hover, didn't interrupt, didn't ask unnecessary questions. She placed a glass precisely where his hand would reach, adjusted the light 1 degree warmer than before, then stepped back into the margin of the room where shadows gathered. Alexander noticed these things without meaning to, the way one notices air only when it changes. For weeks, maybe longer, her presence had been constant, a quiet counterbalance to the sharp edges of his world. She spoke only when spoken to, answered directly, and vanished the moment she sensed she was no longer needed. That was exactly what began to irritate him. Not her actions, but the way she seemed to anticipate him, to know when he wanted silence and when he wanted space, as if she were reading something he had never given permission to be read. The sensation crept up slowly, subtle at first, like a room growing warmer without the heat being turned up. He felt watched without being stared at, accompanied without being followed. To someone else it might have felt comforting. To Alexander, it felt like pressure. During a pause between courses, he finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, carrying the weight that made rooms listen. He said she stood too close. He said the constant attentiveness made it hard to breathe. He said he needed space. The words were measured, clipped, delivered without anger, the way one corrected a minor inconvenience. Emily didn't argue. She didn't apologize excessively or try to explain herself. She simply nodded once, eyes lowered, acknowledging the instruction as if it were any other. Then she stepped back farther than before, and after that, she stayed away. At first, Alexander felt relief. The room felt larger. The air felt still. The silence was absolute, clean, obedient. Minutes passed. Then more. Someone else refilled his glass, but the placement was off by an inch. The lighting remained unchanged. No one adjusted the temperature when the night air cooled the glass walls. He told himself none of it mattered. He told himself this was what he wanted. Yet as the evening stretched on, an unfamiliar sensation settled in his chest. Not pain, not discomfort, but a hollow widening where something had quietly been removed. The room had space now, exactly as he demanded, but the space felt wrong, like an echo waiting for a sound that never came. For the first time in a very long while, Alexander Crow found himself aware of his own breathing, measured and unnecessary, and he wondered when silence had begun to feel heavier than presence. The days that followed unfolded with the same precision Alexander Crow demanded from everything else in his world, yet something subtle remained misaligned. The private dining floor continued to operate flawlessly, staff rotating in silent efficiency, every surface polished, every request fulfilled before it was voiced, but the rhythm felt mechanical now, stripped of its quiet intelligence. Alexander noticed himself looking up when footsteps approached, then looking away when they were not hers. He told himself it was habit. He told himself it meant nothing. But habits did not usually leave a hollow ache behind. Emily Carter had not been reassigned officially. No announcement had been made. She simply no longer appeared within his orbit. Her absence was precise, almost surgical, as if she had excised herself from the space he controlled without disturbing anything else. That, more than anything, unsettled him. Alexander had dismissed people before. He had ordered distances created and lines drawn. What unsettled him now was that she had obeyed perfectly. The city beyond the glass shifted from day to night, headlights threading through streets like veins of light, and Alexander found himself lingering longer after meetings ended, sitting alone with untouched drinks, listening to the faint hum of the building. He became aware of how often she had adjusted things without being asked, how often she had prevented small discomforts before they formed. The temperature was a fraction too cool tonight. The light reflected too sharply off the table surface. None of it mattered, and yet all of it did. He caught himself remembering details that had once seemed insignificant, the way she waited half a second longer before stepping away, the way she positioned herself so she was always within reach but never intrusive. He had called it suffocating. Now he realized it had been balance. Somewhere on the lower floors, Emily Carter continued her shifts. She moved through crowded sections now, carrying trays heavier than the ones she had once handled upstairs, navigating louder spaces where attention was demanded rather than anticipated. She did her job the same way she always had, quietly, carefully, without complaint. She did not look up toward the upper levels. She did not ask questions. She had understood the boundary the moment it was spoken, and she had respected it completely. That was the part Alexander had not anticipated. He had expected hesitation, maybe confusion, perhaps even an apology. He had not expected withdrawal, so clean it left no trace. Late one evening, as rain streaked the glass walls and blurred the skyline into muted color, Alexander finally asked a question he had never needed to ask before. It was simple. Where is she now? The answer came quickly, factual, unembellished. She had requested fewer hours upstairs. She had said she preferred other assignments. No complaint had been filed. No explanation offered. Alexander dismissed the staff member with a nod and remained standing by the window long after the conversation ended. For the first time, the space around him felt vast in a way that offered no comfort. He understood then that the silence he had demanded was not empty. It was deliberate. Emily Carter had not left in anger. She had left in understanding, and that realization carried more weight than any argument ever could. Alexander Crowe did not summon Emily Carter back, even though he could have done so with a word, a message, a single instruction that would have been obeyed without question. That restraint marked a change he did not yet fully understand. Instead, he began to observe his world the way he had not needed to in centuries, paying attention to the spaces between moments rather than the moments themselves. Meetings ended, and he did not immediately rise. Dinners concluded, and he did not leave the table. The city continued its endless motion below, taxis threading through streets, lights pulsing like a living thing, and Alexander stood at the glass more often now, hands clasped behind his back, listening to the faint sounds of a building settling around him. He realized he had mistaken control for clarity. Emily had never crowded him. She had organized the chaos he carried without asking permission to do so. On a Thursday evening marked by a steady rain that blurred the skyline into soft streaks of gray and gold, Alexander descended to a lower level unannounced. He did not wear the tailored jacket that usually signaled authority. He moved through the space as another presence among many, unnoticed by most, recognized by some, ignored by those too busy to care. The room was louder here, full of conversation and movement, trays clinking, chairs scraping lightly across the floor. Emily stood near the far end, balancing a tray with practiced ease, her expression composed, her attention focused outward rather than inward. She had changed nothing about the way she worked. That constancy struck him harder than any accusation could have. She did not look toward him. She did not pause. She did not acknowledge the shift in the room that others sensed instinctively. When she passed near him, close enough that he could hear the measured rhythm of her breathing, she continued on as if he were simply another guest. The silence between them was different now. It was not empty. It was intentional. Alexander understood then that silence could be chosen as deliberately as speech, and that choice carried weight. He remained where he was long after she moved on, aware of something loosening inside his chest, something that had been clenched so long he had forgotten it could move. Later, alone again, he replayed the memory not for what had happened, but for what had not. No confrontation, no apology, no plea. Emily Carter had given him exactly what he asked for, and in doing so had shown him the cost of careless authority. He thought of the word he had used, suffocating, and recognized it now as a misnaming, a projection of his own discomfort with being seen without being examined. Her presence had not taken his space. It had steadied it. As the night stretched toward morning and the rain slowed to a quiet mist, Alexander made a decision that did not feel like a command. He would not order her return. He would not redefine the boundaries she had respected. Instead, he would wait. Not because he lacked power, but because for the first time in centuries, he understood that some distances could only be crossed by invitation. The realization settled quietly, without drama or declaration, and for the first time since her absence began, the silence around him did not feel hollow. It felt honest. Time passed in a way Alexander Crowe had never measured before, not in nights survived or empires managed, but in moments where restraint replaced command. He continued to see Emily Carter on the lower levels from a distance, sometimes catching the quiet efficiency of her movement reflected in polished surfaces, sometimes hearing her voice briefly as she addressed another guest, calm and professional, unchanged. Each encounter confirmed the same truth. She had not withdrawn out of fear. She had adjusted out of respect. That distinction mattered more than he wanted to admit. One evening, as the city baked under late summer heat and the building's climate systems worked tirelessly to maintain a perfect interior balance, Alexander noticed something unexpected. The tension he had once felt around her absence had shifted. It no longer pressed against his chest. Instead, it lingered deeper, quieter, like an unanswered question he carried with him from room to room. He began to recognize how rarely anyone around him chose rather than complied. Orders defined his world. Consent rarely entered it. Emily's silence had not been obedience. It had been choice. That realization reframed every interaction he had replayed in his mind. The words he had spoken had not wounded her pride. They had clarified her boundaries. On a night when the city lights flickered against low clouds and thunder rolled faintly in the distance, Alexander found himself standing near the service corridor that separated public spaces from staff areas. A place he had never needed to acknowledge. He did not cross it. He waited. Emily emerged moments later, adjusting her apron, reviewing a note on a small tablet, focused on her next task. When she looked up and saw him, there was no shock in her expression, only awareness. She paused, not because she had been summoned, but because she chose to stop. Alexander spoke first, his voice steady, without command or accusation. He said her name, nothing more. The single word carried more weight than any order he had ever given. Emily met his gaze briefly, then nodded, acknowledging him the way she would any presence deserving of courtesy. She did not step closer. She did not retreat. She waited. That balance unsettled him and steadied him at the same time. He told her he had been wrong. Not loudly, not dramatically. He said he had mistaken care for intrusion. He said the space felt different without her awareness shaping it. He did not ask her to return upstairs. He did not promise change. He simply spoke the truth as he understood it now. Emily listened without interruption, her expression composed, her posture relaxed but guarded. When he finished, she did not respond immediately. Silence stretched between them, not heavy, not sharp, but deliberate. Finally, she said she had heard him the first time as well. She said she had believed him. She said giving space was sometimes the most respectful response. There was no accusation in her tone, only clarity. Alexander understood then that regret did not entitle him to repair. It only entitled him to acknowledgement. He nodded, accepting that reality without resistance. When Emily turned to continue on her way, he did not stop her. He watched her disappear down the corridor, aware that something fundamental had shifted, not because he had spoken, but because he had listened. The silence that followed did not close in around him. It expanded, leaving room for something unfamiliar and fragile. Possibility. The weeks that followed settled into a quieter pattern, one neither of them named but both recognized. Alexander Crowe stopped watching the lower floors from afar and began noticing the building itself again. The way sound traveled differently at certain hours, the way the city exhaled just before dawn. He did not look for Emily Carter, and yet he noticed when her presence passed near him like a change in pressure. They crossed paths occasionally, always by chance, never by design. When they did, there was no awkwardness, only a calm acknowledgement that felt earned rather than forced. Emily continued her work with the same measured focus, her world defined by tasks completed well and boundaries held with quiet confidence. She no longer anticipated Alexander's needs, and that absence forced him to confront his own habits. He reached for a glass that had not been placed just right. He waited for a room to adjust itself and realized it would not unless he asked. The adjustment was subtle but constant, a re-education of attention rather than authority. One late afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the glass and painted long lines across the floor, Alexander found himself seated in a public lounge he had never used before. It was ordinary, intentionally so, designed for conversation rather than command. Emily was assigned there that day. When she approached his table, she did so as she would any other, offering service without assumption. He thanked her, fully, deliberately, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. She accepted them without surprise. In that moment, he understood that respect was not something reclaimed by regret, but built through repetition. He began to speak to her more often, never about the past, never about what he had lost, only about the present moment, the weather, the pace of the day, the way the city seemed to slow when storms approached. Emily responded when she wished, offered silence when she did not, and Alexander learned to receive both, without interpreting either as rejection. The space between them became something else entirely, not a void but a margin where choice existed. One evening, as the building emptied and the city lights flickered on in uneven waves, Emily paused near his table longer than usual. She asked if everything was satisfactory. The question was professional, but there was room in it for more. Alexander answered honestly. He said it was different. He said different did not mean worse. Emily nodded, considering that, then said sometimes space made room for things to be seen clearly. The comment was not directed. It did not need to be. As she turned to leave, Alexander felt no urge to stop her. He had learned the cost of that impulse. Instead, he watched the room fill with the quiet hum of evening, aware that something had been restored not by reclaiming what was lost, but by honoring what had been chosen. The silence no longer pressed in on him. It settled around him like a boundary he had learned to respect. And for the first time since he had spoken the words he could not take back, Alexander Crow understood that regret could be transformed, not into possession, but into patience. By the time autumn settled over the city, Alexander Crow no longer measured his days by outcomes alone. He noticed transitions now, the shift in light as afternoons shortened, the way conversations softened as evenings cooled. His world remained ordered, powerful, efficient, but the sharpness that once defined it had dulled into something more deliberate. Emily Carter remained part of that world, though no longer orbiting its center. Their interactions stayed restrained, respectful, shaped by an understanding that neither of them rushed to define. Alexander found himself appreciating that restraint more than certainty. It forced him to listen instead of anticipate, to observe rather than command. One morning, as rain tapped steadily against the glass and the city moved at a slower pace, Alexander arrived earlier than usual. The building was quieter then, staff preparing rather than performing, the atmosphere almost human in its imperfections. Emily was there, organizing a service station with calm precision. When she noticed him, she offered a brief greeting, polite and neutral. He returned it in kind. They stood within the same space without tension, the silence between them neither guarded nor inviting, simply present. Alexander realized how rare that was in his life. He spoke then, not to correct or confess, but to ask. He asked how she found the change. The question was simple, unweighted. Emily considered it carefully before answering. She said the work was different. She said it required more attention, more communication. She said she did not mind. There was no hidden message in her tone. Alexander nodded, absorbing the information without interpreting it as permission or refusal. The restraint felt unfamiliar, but right. As the day unfolded, he carried that exchange with him, not as a turning point, but as confirmation. Trust was not rebuilt through grand gestures. It grew through consistency, through the quiet acknowledgement of another person's autonomy. That evening, he chose a seat in a shared space again, not out of strategy, but habit forming. Emily approached. Later, offered service, and this time he asked her opinion on something trivial, the warmth of the room, the placement of the light. She answered honestly, without deference, and adjusted nothing unless he requested it. The difference mattered. When she stepped away, Alexander felt no loss, no pressure, only a steady sense of balance. He understood now that what he had once called suffocation had been his own resistance to vulnerability, a discomfort with being affected by someone who asked for nothing in return. Emily had never claimed space. She had offered it, and when it was rejected, she had reclaimed herself without resentment. That realization followed him as night settled in and the building quieted. Standing alone by the window, Alexander reflected on the centuries he had spent mistaking dominance for connection, control for clarity. He had learned power easily. He was learning patience slowly. Somewhere below, Emily continued her shift, unaware of the full weight of his thoughts, and that was as it should be. She was not responsible for his understanding. The silence between them no longer carried regret. It carried respect. And in that space, Alexander Crow felt something steady take root, not urgency, not desire, but the rare certainty that whatever came next would be chosen, not taken. Winter arrived quietly, the kind that softened the city rather than freezing it, and with it came a clarity Alexander Crow could no longer ignore. The patience he had learned was no longer passive. It asked something of him. He realized that waiting without intention was simply another form of control, one that disguised itself as restraint. So he chose differently. He arranged a meeting not as an order but as an offer, a time and place where choice would remain intact. He asked through proper channels, with language stripped of authority, whether Emily Carter would be willing to speak with him outside the rhythm of service, on neutral ground, with no expectations attached. The response came later that day, concise and honest. She would. The lounge he selected was modest, designed for conversation rather than spectacle, its windows framing a muted stretch of river where ice drifted slowly along the current. When Emily arrived, she did so on time, dressed simply, her posture relaxed but attentive. Alexander stood when she entered, a small courtesy that felt significant. They sat across from each other with a table. Between them, a boundary neither rushed to cross. He spoke first, not to explain himself again, but to state his intention. He said he wanted to understand what space meant to her, not to redefine it, but to respect it properly. He said he did not expect anything in return. Emily listened, her expression thoughtful, and then she spoke with the same clarity that had guided her silence. She said space was not distance for its own sake. It was the freedom to choose presence without pressure. She said what had hurt was not the words themselves, but the assumption behind them. Alexander accepted that without defense. He acknowledged the assumption plainly, named it for what it was, and let it rest there. The conversation moved carefully after that, not into the past, but into shared observations, the city, the changing seasons, the way routines shaped people without their noticing. They did not rush toward agreement. They allowed differences to remain. When the hour ended, Alexander did not extend it. He thanked her for her time. Emily stood, met his gaze, and said she appreciated the honesty. She did not promise more. She did not withdraw either. In the weeks that followed, the shift was subtle but undeniable. Emily accepted occasional invitations to shared spaces, always with the option to decline, always on her terms. Alexander learned to ask without expectation and to accept answers without interpretation. The power dynamic that once defined their interactions softened into something balanced, something earned. He noticed how easily silence now settled between them, not as absence, but as shared understanding. One evening, as the river reflected a pale winter sky and the city lights blinked on one by one, Emily paused before leaving and said she felt comfortable again. The word landed gently and stayed. Alexander did not reach for it. He simply acknowledged it, aware that comfort was not a destination but a practice. As she left, he remained seated, watching the slow movement of ice outside, understanding that seeking did not mean taking, and that the greatest reversal of power he had ever experienced came not from command, but from the humility to ask and the discipline to wait. As winter deepened, the city seemed to move more slowly, and within that slowed rhythm Alexander Crow found a steadiness he had not known before. The invitations he extended to Emily Carter remained simple, always framed as options rather than expectations, and she accepted some while declining others without explanation. Each answer was received the same way, without reaction, without recalculation. The balance held because it was allowed to. One evening, after a light snowfall softened the streets and muted the usual noise, they found themselves sharing a quiet corner of the building cafe, the kind of place designed to be overlooked. Steam rose from their cups as the windows fogged slightly, and outside, traffic crawled in patient lines. They spoke less now, and when they did, it was with an ease that did not search for meaning beneath every word. Emily mentioned a small apartment she had recently moved into, closer to her sister, warmer, quieter. Alexander listened without comment, noting the way she spoke about it not as an escape, but as a choice. He realized how rarely anyone spoke to him about choices that were not influenced by his presence. The thought humbled him. When silence settled between them, it did not signal uncertainty. It felt like a shared pause, a moment neither needed to fill. Alexander understood then that trust had returned, not because he had earned forgiveness, but because he had honored autonomy consistently. The distinction mattered. As weeks passed, the world beyond the building shifted toward the promise of spring, and with it came a subtle change in Emily. She lingered a moment longer during conversations. She asked him questions in return, small ones, about his routines, his preferences, the parts of the city he noticed when he walked alone. Alexander answered honestly, careful not to shape his responses to impress. He spoke of quiet hours before dawn, of observing rather than directing, of learning to exist without constant assertion. Emily nodded, recognizing something familiar in that adjustment. One night, as they stood near the exit after another unremarkable conversation, Emily said she appreciated that he no longer tried to define what this was. The statement was not a challenge. It was an observation. Alexander acknowledged it simply, aware that definition had once been his reflex, a way to secure control. Now he let the moment remain undefined. The absence of pressure felt like a gift neither of them had named. As they parted, Alexander watched her walk into the city without the urge to follow, without the need to hold on to the moment. He understood that presence was meaningful only when freely given. Alone again, he stood beneath the building lights, listening to the quiet hum of systems working unseen, and reflected on the transformation he had undergone. Power still resided with him. That had not changed. What had changed was his relationship to it. Silence was no longer something he demanded or feared. It was something he shared. And in that shared quiet, Alexander Crow felt no regret pressing against him. Only a calm awareness that what had once been lost had returned in a different form, not as possession, but as mutual respect, steady and unforced, with room enough for both of them to breathe. Spring arrived without announcement, and Alexander Crow noticed it not by the calendar, but by the way light lingered longer on the river, and the way the city breathed more easily at dusk. The building felt different too, less like a fortress and more like a place people passed through by choice. Emily Carter remained part of that passage, sometimes present, sometimes not, her rhythm steady and self-directed. Alexander no longer tracked her movements. He trusted them. That trust marked the truest change. One evening near the end of the season, they stood together by the windows after a quiet conversation that had wandered from small observations to shared silences and back again. Outside, the water moved slowly, carrying reflections of street lamps that broke and reformed with each current. Emily said she had accepted a new role within the organization, one that offered growth without isolation, responsibility without proximity. She said it suited her. Alexander listened, absorbing the information without calculating how it affected him. He recognized the instinct and let it pass. He told her he was glad. He meant it without condition. There was no promise exchanged, no future defined. What existed between them did not require either. As they parted that night, Alexander remained by the glass longer than usual, aware of a familiar impulse to hold on and equally aware of his choice not to act on it. The city lights flickered on in patient sequence, and he understood that what he once feared as loss had been transformation all along. Days later, during an unremarkable afternoon, Alexander sat alone in a shared space, the kind he now favored, and reflected on the path that had led him there. He remembered the moment. He had spoken carelessly, the way authority had disguised discomfort, the way silence had answered with clarity rather than confrontation. He understood now that regret had been necessary, not as punishment, but as instruction. It had taught him the difference between presence that demands and presence that invites. When Emily passed by later, their exchange was brief and easy, a nod, a shared acknowledgement, nothing more. And that was enough. Alexander felt no ache at the simplicity of it. He felt grounded by it. He realized that the space he once claimed as his own was larger now because it was shared with understanding rather than control. As evening settled and the building quieted, Alexander Crow stood by the window one last time, hands resting loosely at his sides, listening to the soft hum of a world in balance. He did not miss the past version of himself. He did not wish to reclaim what had been lost. He recognized that the silence he had once resented had given him room to learn, to change, to breathe. And in that space, he carried a truth that would guide him long after this chapter closed. Power does not come from filling every space. Sometimes it comes from knowing when to let silence remain, and having the humility to understand what it gives back.